Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to be covering pedal kickback, including what it is, how does one calculate it, and most interestingly, whether or not you actually need to worry about it. Over the past several months I've received several questions about it, and one of the most intriguing questions had me researching the effect of wheel speed on pedal kickback. I'll be very interested to hear your comments about this after the video. Let's dive right in by first looking at the general theory of pedal kickback. For this video I'm going to be using the Specialized Enduro as an example, mostly because it has one of the largest pedal kickbacks of its competitors. As a modern suspension moves through its travel, the rear axle almost always moves further from the bottom bracket. One of the most important reasons for this is that a more rearward wheel path helps with the performance on square edge hits. If one looks at the wheel path, you will notice that it follows an arc that is roughly centered around the top of the front chainring. Some might look at this and assume that there shouldn't be any pedal kickback, or only very minimal, because the chain path roughly runs through the suspension's center of curvature, and thus can just pivot around this point. However, the important thing to remember is that for the analysis of pedal kickback, the wheel is still connected to the ground. So rather than the rear axle just rotating around the center of curvature, the wheel is also rotating around the axle to maintain contact with the ground, without slipping. As a result, a point at the top of the rear cassette will still be at the top even at full travel, and the overall distance the chain spans will increase. Now, because the hub can only freely rotate forward and the wheel is actually rotating backward with respect to the rear swing arm, there is only one option to increase the chain length: rotate the front chainring backward, resulting in what is called pedal kickback. Now, I can already hear the people who are watching this video saying that there are other geometry changes that will also impact pedal kickback, as well as others saying, but the wheel can slip against the ground, and when moving, the wheel isn't fixed to the ground. Trust me, I get it. I'll get to these topics later in the video, but for now I thought it's important to at least cover the basic principle. There are two reasons the pedal kickback is generally considered to be bad, and they are very related. In theory, as the suspension moves through its travel, the pedal should be lifting the one foot and dropping the other foot, causing major disruption to the body position. In practice though, one is generally either pedaling or holding the pedals level. While pedaling, the kickback will cause one pedal to fight against your stroke by pushing harder against your one foot, while the other pedal will be pulled away from your foot, reducing grip, making for a very inconsistent pedal stroke in technical terrain when you're using a lot of your travel. This can get very tiring on long rides, the first disadvantage of pedal kickback. The second disadvantage occurs when holding the pedals fully level while descending. During this, the suspension movement will be hindered and will feel much firmer than if there was no chain at all. Think of it this way: the chain needs to extend rearward for the suspension to move through its travel. So if you hold the pedals level, the chain can extend rearward, and thus the suspension can't move. There is actually a case where pedal kickback can be advantageous, and that's when pumping down a track or trail. When you pump, you are holding the pedals level and forcing the suspension to compress, which means that the wheel has only one option to counteract the chain growth, and that is to rotate forward. As a result, every time you compress the suspension, it's as though you're pedaling very slightly without actually moving your feet. Sweet! The faster the pump, the more powerful the effective pedal stroke. This isn't the only reason why pumping gives you speed, because pumping also works on hardtail, but it can help. For many bikes, the wheel path is either mostly vertical with a pronounced arc forward deeper in the travel, or a smooth arc around a point close to the bottom bracket. In these cases, it's tough to say what the driving factor in each frame design was. Factors can include wheel path, anti-squat, anti-rise, or chain growth, amongst many others. In general, my guess is that the designers found a happy medium between all these parameters. Some companies such as Forbidden, as well as several downhill bike manufacturers, have clearly prioritized rearward axle paths. In these cases, they've needed to include idler pulleys on their frames to try and reduce pedal kickback as much as possible. If you haven't already seen my video on the Forbidden Druid, which discusses the effect of idler pulleys, a link is included in the top right. You've probably noticed in all my previous videos that I've chosen to use chain growth as an indicator of pedal kickback. The reason for this is that it gives a good indication of pedal kickback without being reliant on any particular gear. It also happens to be much easier to calculate, but that isn't the main reason I've chosen to standardize on chain growth. To calculate pedal kickback, there are three factors to consider. The first is the chain growth itself, which is as easy as measuring the distance between the rear axle and the bottom bracket. Knowing that the circumference of a circle is defined by this formula, where r is the radius of the circle, one can calculate how far the chainring needs to rotate backwards in order to extend the chain by the measured chain growth. This distance is the arc length, which equals our circumference multiplied by a pedal kickback angle divided by 360 degrees. Rearranging the formula gives us the pedal kickback. For the Enduro with a 32-tooth chainring with a radius of 65 mm, this works out to be 26.6 degrees. The next two factors to consider are affected by the overall angle of the bike frame with respect to the ground. By this, I'm referring to whether the front suspension is compressed or not during the analysis. I'm going to be doing the analysis assuming only the rear suspension compresses, but one could alternatively do it with the front suspension compressed as well. Just note that the numbers you arrive at will be slightly different, as the bottom bracket will be lower if the front suspension is also compressed. The first of these two factors to consider is the change in wrap angle on the cassette and chainring as the suspension compresses. As you can see, the wrap angle in the rear cassette will increase, while the wrap angle on the front chainring will decrease. If one measures the change in angle of wrap, one can use the same formula as before to calculate the arc length. For the Enduro, the extra distance wrapped around the 50-tooth rear cassette is 24mm, while the unwrap on the front 32-tooth chainring is only 15.4mm. The keen-eyed observer will notice that the ratio of these two is the same as the ratio of the cog tooth number between the rear and front. If both front and rear cog were the same size, the wrap angles would result in no effect on pedal kickback. However, in our case, where there is a difference, the front chainring needs to rotate backwards even further. For this, I'll once again use the arc length calculation to find the additional increase in pedal kickback angle to release this amount of chain, which for the Enduro works out to be about 7.5 degrees. The last of the factors was not immediately obvious when I started researching into pedal kickback, and relates to how much the wheel rotates due to the change in wheelbase during compression. So far, the analysis has relied on the geometry of the suspension alone, and assumes that the same spot of the rear tire is glued to the ground. However, in reality, it's better to assume that the rider instead can only move up and down during the suspension movement, which can be justified if one considers that the rider is the largest weight in the system, and thus inertia would prevent the rider from suddenly accelerating forward or backward when compared to, say, a wheel. Using this fact, it hopefully makes sense that if the horizontal chainstay length increases during compression, the tire would need to rotate backward, and vice versa if the chainstay length decreases. One can again use the same arc length formula to calculate the angle the rear wheel needs to rotate in order to travel the difference in chainstay length. Again, using the ratio of rear and front cog sizes, one can calculate the last factor in the front chainring kickback, that being 1.9 degrees for the Enduro. Adding all three factors, those being chain growth between the axle and bottom bracket, wrap angle changes around the front and rear cog, and rear wheel rotation due to changing the chainstay length, the pedal kickback for the Specialized Enduro works out to be around 36 degrees in total. To me, and likely yourself, this sounds huge, which brings me to my last point, and probably the one that might spur on the largest amount of conversation in the comments. Should you even care about pedal kickback if you're moving? To determine how significant pedal kickback is, I'm going to look at two different cases. The first being if you launch off a drop and use up all your travel, and the second being if you're pedaling. In the first case, let's assume somebody launches off a 1.5 meter drop onto a flat landing. This is kind of a worst case scenario to explore whether there's a speed at which you won't notice the kickback. Using common physics equations, one can determine that the rider will be traveling at 5.4 meters per second vertically when they hit the ground. If we use the 170 millimeters of travel on the Specialized Enduro as the stopping distance, we can then determine that it'll take only about 26 milliseconds to use up the full travel and decelerate the rider to a stop. Assuming the rider is not in the largest rear gear and instead in, say, a 25-tooth gear, which is more representative of rear-wheeled riding, the pedal kickback is only 24.5 degrees. Rather than having the front chainring rotating backwards, we can instead eliminate pedal kickback by rotating the rear wheel forward to counteract the chain pull. By using the ratio of front and rear cog sizes, one can determine that the rear cassette, and by necessity the rear wheel, needs to rotate forward 31.3 degrees in 26 milliseconds in order for the rider to not feel the pedal kickback upon landing. Using the radius of the wheel, this equates to a distance of about 0.2 meters that the rear wheel needs to cover in 26 milliseconds, which in turn equates to a bike speed of about 7.7 meters per second, or 28 kilometers an hour. By this, I can conclude that even in a worst-case scenario, it is feasible for a rider to not experience pedal kickback even at a reasonable downhill speed. For interest, if the drop was only 0.75 meters, that required speed to avoid pedal kickback would decrease to only 20 kilometers an hour. We're now going to look at the other case where you're pedaling along a stretch of trail at say 16 kilometers an hour at 90 RPM cadence and hit a square edge only with your rear wheel that causes your suspension to compress 50%. For this analysis, I'm going to make several assumptions for the ease of understanding and calculation. Firstly, I'm assuming the rider lifted the front wheel sufficiently that the front suspension didn't compress. Secondly, that the rider is miraculously able to continue traveling at 16 kilometers an hour despite hitting a large bump. Finally, that the rebound and compression is set that the rear travel perfectly absorbs the bump without affecting the overall geometry of the bike other than moving the rear swing arm up. Using the intersection of the bump with the wheel, one can calculate the time it'll take for the suspension to compress 50% by measuring the distance covered, which is around 238 millimeters. Dividing this by the bike speed results in a suspension compression time of approximately 53 milliseconds. At a cadence of 90 rpm, this equates to a forward rotation of the front chainring of 28.4 degrees. Adding the 12.3 degrees of pedal kickback from the 50% compression, and utilizing the ratio of the front 32-tooth chainring to the 25-tooth rear cassette, yields a required total rotation of the rear wheel of 51.8 degrees to avoid pedal kickback. Unfortunately, the rear wheel only rotates 39 degrees in this example, so unfortunately, while pedaling, the rider will still experience some pedal kickback, around 10 degrees, as a result of the act of pedaling taking up the chain slack that would have been present in this example if the rider had just been coasting instead. What do you think? Is pedal kickback really noticeable when you're riding? Hopefully you found this video useful in understanding pedal kickback, including the pros and cons of it, how to calculate it, and whether you'll actually feel it while riding. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video to let me know that you like what I'm doing on the channel. And remember, if you want to be a part of the recurring polls to help decide which bike to look at next, or just to support the channel, make sure to head over to my Patreon page using the link down below. Until next time, stay safe.